Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the first moves of New York City Mayor Zohran Mamdani, Trump's threat to attack Iran, and a new theory for how the Frankfurt School destroyed the future. I'm joined by Ashley Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So, Geoff, you're one of the New Yorkers on the podcast. How are you feeling in the light of a new dawn as Mamdani takes over the city?
I'm interested to see how it will go. I'm not either particularly caught up in the Mamdani mania nor particularly worried we are headed for some sort of collapse into, sort of Soviet-style breadline dystopia. I think it'll be, or for that matter, Sharia. I guess sort of Soviet Sharia would be like the synthesis here. You sort of have bread lines, or like the lines for getting your stuff from halal butchers are really long, or something like that. I assume there are some parts of the Soviet bloc where maybe it looks kind of like this, Central Asia or something. But I don't know. I did notice, I will say, I didn't really tune into the oath-taking event, but I caught sort of snippets of it and read, sort of skimmed the transcript of the speech and caught snippets of some of the other speeches. Two things that stood out to me in the speech. One, it was interesting to see him cite both abundance and affordability as goals. So many people remarked on this. I saw people on the left kind of sniping at him for using the A word, aka abundance, which has become associated with a centrist faction of the Democratic Party. Notably, the pundits Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, and who published a book at the beginning of this year under that title. And I read a couple of months ago a piece in New York Magazine that was about, the war for the future of the Democratic Party. And on one side, you had the abundance faction, and then on the other side, you had the Mamdani, AOC, et cetera, sort of Democratic Socialist faction. And, it seemed that Mamdani was extending an olive branch to the abundance faction by citing abundance in his speech, and also citing it alongside affordability, which has become sort of the standard Democratic Party line against Trump, which now Trump is sort of arguing is a hoax, I believe is the term he's used for it. And so clearly he's trying to present himself as in sync with the broader party coalition rather than as at odds with it. And so you saw some people on the left getting mad about that aspect of his speech, that he was using these sort of soft centrist terms as opposed to, more forceful ones. But then on the other hand, you saw people criticizing, and I'd say the phrase that has been most cited and criticized even by people on the left, I would say, is this thing about the warmth, replacing the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism, which, I did think was kind of, it was bizarre, to be honest, that he would go there. I saw people on the left saying, he could have said solidarity. He could have said, I don't know, community, cooperation. Like, there are all these terms that he could have used that were not collectivism, which generally doesn't have a particularly positive set of valences in the even within the Democratic coalition. So there was a kind of contradiction there where the speech somehow both was designed to appeal to the broad center of opinion in the Democratic Party, while at the same time, using terms like collectivism that even people on the left don't seem to think are very useful. And so I saw a few kind of left commentators saying, this guy needs to get a new speechwriter. So
he wrote it himself.
Oh, he wrote it himself.
I believe, because he said something about, when I was writing this speech.
Okay.
And I took that as him saying, look, guys, this is my personal touch on it. But I think professional help would be called for. Collectivism is a National Review term.
Yeah, right.
That's a word that appears in that magazine, and it does not appear in Jacobin.
Yeah.
So it's a curious choice. And just in terms of that one statement, I'd maybe note that there is a certain critique of kind of liberal and modern societies that argues that there's a kind of dynamic that's kind of in a way symbiotic between individualism and collectivism, right? That when more kind of local forms of community break down, or the family or religious institutions, associations, things like this, and people are individualized, that's when they need to look to this broader kind of national level collective for support, because they no longer have those other forms of support. So, in Mamdani's mind, there's an absolute opposition between individualism and collectivism. But I would say certainly when those specific terms are used, there's a pretty venerable argument that the two things actually go together. And I'll just note that in Mamdani's speech, there are certain hints of the way those things can go together. He says, we will tell a new story of our city. It will not be a tale of one city governed only by the 1%, nor will it be a tale of two cities, the rich versus the poor. It will be a tale of 8.5 million cities, each of them a New Yorker with hopes and fears, each a universe. So, though he's saying I'm for collectivism and I'm against individualism, he says this is a New York. We will have 8.5 million New Yorks. Each person will have his own New York. So there is, within Mamdani's own rhetoric, a very strong sense that the individual is the standard by which things are measured. And so I think that Mamdani's speech is open to that line of critique, that individuals, certain kind of individualism can advance collectivism, and collectivism can kind of advance individualism because it often is uncomfortable with alternate forms of community or solidarity. In terms of Mamdani's project, I'm going to just put my marker down and say I'm very skeptical of where things will go. He may have some lasting achievements. I think if you look at the last real attempt at progressive governance in New York under Bill de Blasio, he had his kind of universal pre-K initiative, which is in place, I think has popular support and isn't going to go away soon or easily. So de Blasio had that real achievement. And Mamdani may have some similar achievements. But I'm skeptical of them. And I think that things will fail to work out for him in a way that a lot of critics, haven't yet kind of, or it'll work out in a way that's a bit surprising. So a lot of critics of Mamdani's call him, a socialist, right? And he claims that label for himself. And so there's this notion that it's going to be a kind of overextension of government that will lead to disaster. We don't yet know how probably his most famous initiative, the city-run, or I think I should say city-owned, and that's his term, city-owned grocery stores, will work. But I think it's important to realize that he talks about them as city-owned grocery stores, and there's an important distinction between something that is city-owned and city-run. So Kansas City has a city-owned grocery store. That city-owned grocery store has seen a huge fall off in customers It's become a money sinkhole that the city is constantly pouring money into. But what I want to note here is that it is run by a nonprofit. Similarly, Chicago, which is exploring its own city-owned grocery stores, commissioned a feasibility study, and this study from the consultants, right? So the consultants have been paid, and what they recommended to Mayor Brandon Johnson was that the city not attempt to operate the supermarket itself, but it rather partner with a for-profit operator, a nonprofit operator, or a co-op. So I think that there is a notion that Mamdani is just going to kind of extend the reach of the government into everything, but there's a more complex process that's likely to occur, and that is, the city partnering with nonprofits, giving them leases, giving them money, and then they're supposed to deliver these services. So it's going to be a kind of extension of the kind of rule by NGOs that Daryl Paul described for Compact in his article, Why NGOs Run Your World. We've seen some other moves from Mamdani. He's revoked some of Eric Adams's executive orders. He's revoked a more expansive definition of anti-Semitism that Adams brought in. So you'll continue to see contestation on those lines. But I think really Mamdani's project is going to rise or fail on the success of some of his signature initiatives, the city-run grocery stores, free buses, and then public safety. And, he's talked a lot about this new kind of expanded attempt to handle mental health problems through basically social workers rather than policing. And I'm pretty skeptical about how well that will work. But I think, when you look at Mamdani's speech, the important thing to realize is that he is trying to offer, a positive vision that's exciting. And one reason he won is that the kind of, the long trail of Bloombergism in New York just exhausted itself, of a more kind of technocratic liberalism. And when Bloomberg was in office, that kind of technocratic Democratic Party did have its own spiritedness and its own ambition. There really was an optimism about using market mechanisms or kind of this smart technocratic city planning and how it could improve our lives. And, whatever charter schools and Teach for America and bike lanes, and these were seen as things that would really improve the city. So there was a certain excitement. I think, I'll also note that one of the things that gave that Bloomberg kind of era liberalism and energy was its social liberalism. So, Bloomberg was very, like really any Democratic politician, but it had a certain character there. Bloomberg embraced, gay rights, which back then had more salience than they do today because they were still contested, right? Gay marriage was not, a constitutional right recognized by the Supreme Court. So, and there were a lot of Republicans who were actively opposing gay rights, and so it had a certain energy. And Cuomo, when he was governor of New York, said, if you are a bigot, if you kind of deny the right to marry, or if you're deny a woman's right to choose, you have no place as a New Yorker. So those kind of Democrats who kind of appear very centrist now, they had a certain kind of cultural energy that they derived from these socially liberal causes. And I think, partly through the success of those causes, that energy dissipated. And so the kind of the more technocratic wing of the Democratic Party was deprived of one of the ways in which it really claimed a sort of left-wing or liberatory potential. And transgenderism hasn't sufficiently replaced the energy that gay rights once provided the party, because it's much more divisive within the Democratic Party than gay rights were.
I think you probably already sort of dealt with this fairly well, but the line that everyone had pulled out of Mamdani's speech about collectivism, I swear it was placed there in Trump style just to get supporters excited and make rivals as angry as possible. And what came after that, or just before that in the speech and just after, really spoke to the fact that there is a kind of a relationship between the individual and the collective that Mamdani appears to appreciate slightly, appreciate to a certain extent, and an appeal to universalism, which of course will warm my heart. But I think it's worth reiterating, because I found the discussion about it online to be so annoying, is that I think the left and right both get this wrong. There's this sense that socialism is collectivism and capitalism is individualism. And it's this very, very annoying black and white thinking that needs to be dispelled. That's not how it works. It's not like we get one or the other. Capitalism already collectivizes. That's the point. We're capable of being individuals to the extent that we are now because of the extraordinary collectivist bent of capitalism. The example that I always use is that I'm freer immensely as a woman now because I don't have to pound millet 8 hours a day. That is done for me, and the whatever food just appears on a supermarket shelf like magic, and then I'm free to think and create and be an individual. And that is something that capitalism does. And socialism and communism are an extension of that individualizing impulse of capitalism as it collectivizes. That is the point. There's a dialectic between the collective and the individual, that as you collectivize more and more production, you free the individual. And capitalism is already doing that. And socialism is the freeing of capitalism from its destructive tendencies. So I feel like that needs to be reiterated, because I see people, collectivism, the warmth of collectivism just scared me so much, because I just thought, well, yeah, in some ways, like being strangled is like a really tight hug. Like that's probably warm, but that's not something that we should ever aspire to. And the other thing that I kind of have been thinking
Nordic
about,
socialism hardest hit by his figure of speech, associating warmth with collectivism and coldness with individualism, and people who believe that the Nordics have pointed the way forward for socialists are devastated by this ill-chosen metaphor.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that I've been thinking about over the past couple of days is the way that sort of part of the thrust behind Mamdani is this pro-Palestine vote, or this pro-Palestine kind of contingent. And I've been more and more concerned, really over the last decade, with the degree to which the left is seeing the main bulwark against capitalism. Well, okay, this is nothing new, and I started that out completely wrong, because obviously the left has, for many, many decades, displaced the revolutionary subject to some other place abroad. Oh, our working class is totally bought off and is not revolutionary. They think they're all little temporarily embarrassed millionaires or billionaires. We have to look elsewhere. And so there's always this hunt for the perfect revolutionary subject somewhere else. And they found this, what they think is the ideal revolutionary subject, in the Palestinian, in the vision of the Palestinian, not the whatever real Palestinians are, don't really matter. But there's this, for them, there's this vision of the Palestinian that is the revolutionary subject, that isn't afraid to use violence, blah, blah, blah. And this is just wonderful. And I would very much caution against that. And I would remind people to think about the fact, how many times have Muslim Arabs been used, and this is going to get me in trouble probably, but whatever, been used against socialist and revolutionary causes? How many times have they been explicitly empowered to destroy socialism? You can think about Moroccans in Spain, mercenaries that were, yes, okay, people fought because they were desperate. This is what some people say, and they were promised, food and land and so on. But some fought out of jihad and against communism. Okay, the CIA explicitly funded what would later become the Taliban against the USSR. Everybody who thinks that Islam is this like proto-communist movement is sorely mistaken. And I'm really annoyed by American socialists for putting all of their eggs in that basket. And this ties into the general point that I want, and I see Geoff looking uncomfortable. So yes, go ahead and correct me.
No. I wasn't uncomfortable at all. I was glad you brought up the regulares, the Moroccan mercenaries in Spain. It's one of my favorite little things to troll the right with. That Franco only won by importing large numbers of African Muslims into Spain, and in fact, you can find propaganda from the Republican side of these these posters about Black babies being born in Spanish villages, the implication being that these these mercenaries were raping Spanish women. So you can find that from the Republican side. So anyway, it's a great little vignette. But yeah, so I almost I kind of want to save the main points I want to make about what Ashley just brought up to a later segment, because it's highly relevant to that.
Yeah, by all means, we can return to that.
Yeah. So troll both the left and right with that, because it is, it's a contradiction to everything that they want, the Muslim to stand for in our conflicts. But the other thing that I wanted to say that ties in with what was the point that I was making about the dialectic is, again, you can see this kind of playing out. I'm going to be excessively Hegelian here and try not to do this, but is that there's this, you can see this same kind of freedom versus authoritarianism dialectic playing out in society in the same way that we're working at this individual collectivist dialectic. And you can see it in our kind of uncertainty around religion, where Christianity is very difficult to govern. The emphasis on individual conscience and so on can make it very difficult to govern. Freedom in general is difficult to govern. But authoritarianism obviously makes it easier to govern, but is extraordinarily stifling. And we're kind of oscillating between these two poles. And what we are not able to do and what we are not able to come up with is, and within that authoritarianism is excessive collectivism. But what we're not able to do and what we are still working out as a society is the kind of central task that history has given us, which is how to be free together. And I think you can see this kind of working out in our political conflicts, in whose side we want to take, where it's people want to reject excessive individualism and go hardcore for authoritarianism. People want to reject collectivism, go hardcore for individualism. And we are just trying to kind of work this out, or reject Christianity and go hardcore for Islam and be oh, this is the radical subject. Look how collectivist they are. Look at them, a bulwark against capitalism, or whatever it might be. And I think we should not lose sight of the task that we have to figure out how to be free together. And we haven't figured that out yet. So that's my big world historical take on Mamdani.
I was just going to add one little thing, which is that the phrase "the warmth of collectivism" evoked for me a moment that it probably didn't evoke for that many people, because or maybe it did, I don't know. But I recently rewatched "It's a Wonderful Life," the most classic Christmas movie, which I hadn't seen for decades. And you could describe the atmosphere of the final scene of that film as invoking the warmth of collectivism, in which this entire community comes together to essentially, in this, highly sort of economically communitarian way, which, invokes kind of ideas of the gift economy, a kind of pre-capitalist mode of production, because essentially, the protagonist has lost this money. It's going to make his loan business go under. But because he's done so much for the community, the entire community comes and chips in, and thereby, ensures that he is not lost. And this is poised against the frigidity of individualism in the figure of Mr. Potter, the sort of monopolist banker who increasingly has come to dominate the town. And so in any case, it's interesting that at least there's a version of this idea which, far from being, and we could debate whether collectivism is the best term for that, but certainly there is a collective pooling of resources that occurs in this scene. That's the whole point of it. And so it's interesting to me that, that the sort of National Review epithet of collectivism would be used to summon up these foreign images of, the Soviet Union and China and so on. But all we have to do is turn to this iconic American cultural product, and we find a scene that could be described that way, and has become sort of the paradigm of the vision of the Christmas spirit in American culture. So, and it's worth noting that film was, despite its current iconic status, it did come under suspicion during the Red Scare because of this basic message. I don't think the message is communist in a sense. It's a kind of communitarian populist vision, which you could trace back to various sorts of currents within American politics that go back quite a long way. But the other thing I'd add here is that it's interesting that, you have plenty of critics of the frigidity of individualism on the right today, on the post-liberal right. In fact, one of the main sort of things that the post-liberal right has hammered away at for the past decade is individualism as an overriding value and its deficiencies. So it is interesting that, although this term for most people immediately evoked these kind of foreign images of, whatever Soviet breadlines and so on, the actual resonances of it within American politics and history could be somewhat more complex. And I'm still of the opinion that it was a very bad line. It was very poorly chosen word, and didn't do Mamdani any favors. But nevertheless, I think it is interesting that you can find, or there are threads you can draw out of it that go in different directions than most of his critics would assume.
For more on Mamdani, I highly recommend Greg Conti's piece for Compact, Mamdani and the Future of the Left. I think the definitive statement on why Mamdani is the most important figure on the American left today, and his success or failure in New York matters nationally. So it looks like we're maybe getting ready to bomb Iran, maybe do more than bomb. President Trump says that the United States is locked and loaded and ready to intervene if Iran kills protesters. I remember 2015 and 2016 when neoconservatives warned that Trump's rise in the Republican Party would signal an abdication of moral leadership by the United States, a dereliction of our duty to stand up for freedom and democracy abroad. Now Trump is saying we're ready to intervene if Iran brutally suppresses a democratic uprising. So are you telling me that the neocons were once again wrong when they said that Trump would be a disaster for their project? I think they might have missed on that one too.
Well, this is not this is not my strong area, but it's rising on the agenda. So I don't know. I like the old leftist in me is like suspicious always. Where I'm like, oh, the US historically funded some not so great, not so liberal regimes. Not funded, sorry, allegedly sort of backed these regimes. And so now they're backing the liberal democratic side. I don't know. That doesn't strike me as something that the US is doing, but then used to doing around the world historically. But then it's Trump. We've got Trump involved in all of this. I don't know. I've seen some discussion online about like this. Oh, it's another example of like white man's burden, where the U.S. is going to try to intervene to free the poor, like non-Western person. But I mean, in this case, is it not us? Is it not our burden to seek freedom and to push against authoritarianism around the world? That seems excessively kind of Pollyannish of me. But I don't know. I mean, there's obviously deeper kind of economic drives behind this. There's a broader kind of agenda. around Iran and war with Iran that may be getting a kind of democratic wash at the moment, which would be more usual and more in tune with previous administrations. And given the way that the United States is approaching South America, that would also seem to fit, giving this sort of same kind of glorious wash to what is essentially a base kind of conflict, a conflict over base resources. But the admirable thing about Trump in the past had been to kind of unabashedly tell the truth about foreign intervention and its purpose. So I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm everything seems to be so contradictory and up in the air with the Trump administration. Very, very difficult to interpret. And I'm not very good on Iran, I will admit. So I don't know, Geoff, rescue me here because I'm not sure what to make of this.
So I would point people back to Nathan Pinkoski's obituary of Dick Cheney, Cheney's last laugh in Compact, where he discussed the problems with how Cheney and his sort of neocon faction have been remembered, and the way that may, sort of set a trap for people on the right who have claimed to, or in some cases seriously attempted to carve out a new foreign policy path. So, I think Nathan's larger point is really that if you follow Cheney's career, it's not that he always espoused some sort of idealistic vision of universal regime change where America goes around and, brings about democratic government in all these hostile lands. That in fact, in many ways, if you look at various phases of his career, he seemed like a kind of restrainer, a sort of more skeptical, a more skeptical kind of critic of overly ambitious foreign policy and military interventions abroad. And so then the question is, how did he end up, despite his prior skepticism of such things, how did he end up being one of the architects of the Bush administration's so-called freedom agenda? And the answer is that, as he accounts for it, is that 9/11 intervened and changed everything. And so, at the same time, I think part of what's interesting about this moment is that we are still operating within the post 9/11 paradigm. So it's not so much that Trump has confronted his own sort of 9/11 events and that's caused him to shift. It's that he is still overseeing the American national security state that was built up in the wake of 9/11, and therefore that itself functions as a kind of a source of direction for policy. It's not a kind of neutral apparatus that can be turned in any direction. It's something that gravitates towards certain kinds of things. And I've been thinking about this, before this Iran sort of saber rattling. I've been thinking about this in terms of the bombings of these boats in the Caribbean and Pacific, supposedly as part of a war against narco-terrorism. And I happen to have been reading this book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, which basically documents the history of the sort of special forces units that were developed, really first in the 1970s and 1980s and involved in various kinds of sort of dirty war type activities in Central America and the Middle East, and really have functioned as a kind of black box within the military, where various things that we don't necessarily want to talk about publicly are sort of carried out with a great deal of secrecy. And that the point of the Fort Bragg cartel is that the secrecy has generated this incredible culture of lack of accountability. And one result of this is that you had incredible levels of not just corruption, but kind of personal depravity in among those working in this realm, who became heavy users of various drugs, as well as involved in drug trafficking, particularly out of Afghanistan. And, at the same time, these were the people who were going, and the thing about these boat bombings, there's sort of extrajudicial killings of alleged quote unquote narco-terrorists. This term narco-terrorism goes back quite a ways and was actually brought up in the context of the Afghanistan war, where bizarrely it was claimed that the Taliban was exporting opium when in fact it was really the U.S. allied factions within Afghanistan that were dominating the global opium trade after the U.S. occupied Afghanistan. So the point of all of this is that, we had these forces that were going around just basically committing extrajudicial killings, committing murder with impunity under orders from the government. This has been going on for decades. And, to go to Ashley's point about, what was supposed to be good about Trump was that he was kind of honest about what was really going on here. You could look at these boat bombings as an example of that, because the point is there have been U.S. forces deployed to go around assassinating suspected or alleged terrorists for decades. What's notable about this is that they are openly bragging about doing this, as opposed to kind of trying to keep it relatively secret, which is what the previous administrations did. And so, there's kind of this brazenness. I wouldn't call it honesty, because the whole rationale for it is completely is just sort of blatantly made up and largely nonsensical. But coming back to the point about Iran here, it's just that it really seems like this administration has come into possession of this whole, vast apparatus. And because the administration is internally conflicted, between factions that, have very different visions of foreign policy and of the U.S. role in the world, it makes sense that it will, in various ways, default to a sort of, repetition of the same kinds of things that have been done, and it will just kind of put its own spin on those. So, a prior example of this would be the escalation of these kind of targeted assassinations under Obama was justified under the rubric of a smart war. And so you can think about how Obama, said he didn't oppose war, he just opposed dumb wars. And this was, one of his campaign lines. And then, once he was in power, he was kind of trying to align himself with Silicon Valley, which of course was talking about, smart devices and smart governance and all these kinds of smart cities and all these new applications of this term smart to imply, sort of high tech. And so Obama framed the continuation of Bush's war on terror as smart war. And so he gave his own kind of spin, his own kind of aesthetic branding to it. But essentially it was a continuation of the same project with the different set of inflections to it. And so I think we can really see this as the same thing. It's the whole apparatus, and it's interesting, right? This is sort of the Trumpian as well as originally left critique of the deep state, right? That the deep state is this kind of unaccountable monstrosity that's been built up over the past 75 years, and that just kind of does its own thing, and that civilian elected officials don't really have much power to control. This is the critique. Like, this is the basic idea of the deep state. The irony of the current moment is that you have, I think I mentioned this in a previous podcast, Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, saying, I don't know, we must fight the deep state or something, which is sort of absurd. but the point is that you sort of you end up with the same apparatus basically being deployed to do the same things, just because that's the path of least resistance. And so what's left to the, again, civilian elected officials is to just kind of put their own spin on it. And so I'd say, basically what you have is the spin being put on it is a lot of bluster, a lot of, just kind of blatant inconsistency and reflections of the kind of mercurial nature of Trump himself. And so this overlay, in the same way that Obama's smart war overlay was supposed to kind of provide a new legitimation and rationale for the continuation of these policies, I think in this case, it's essentially Trump's own personality, which is supposed to kind of reassure us. It's in a sense the opposite of the smart war idea, where it's like, trust the sophistication of the technology to do this. In this case, it's, we'll trust that we have this, this kind of mercurial guy who just kind of does his own thing, and he's in charge now. So whatever he does, that must not be the deep state. It must be, it must be some kind of reflection of the deeper commitments of this character. But it really is just the same thing. It's a continuation of and continuation of the same things that this whole apparatus has been built to do and has continued to do in different forms and to different degrees. And it just has a different, in this case, much more chaotic and confusing sort of ideological overlay to provide legitimation.
Yeah, they're not avoiding dumb wars, they're avoiding cringe wars. So, Geoff, as other Americans have spent their time watching college football, getting drunk, recovering from hangovers over the New Year's holiday, you have spent your time just obsessed with going mad, reading the new book explaining how the Frankfurt School is not, as right-wingers have long said, an attempt to undermine capitalism, the capitalistic West, but is instead so if it's on the left-wing plot to undermine the West, what is the Frankfurt School? And can you tell us a little bit why this group of kind of German thinkers commands so much kind of anxious attention?
It's a good question. I mean, we'd have to, I don't want to get too deeply into the standard right-wing Frankfurt School theory, but suffice to say, it functions as a kind of typical conspiracy theory. You posit some sort of foreign infiltrator, of course, helpful if they happen to be Jewish, who has, been brought in and is sort of planted within the seats of power, and from that position sort of undermines and degrades a society and civilization from within. So that's roughly the Frankfurt School conspiracy theory promulgated by various, varyingly mainstream or fringe right-wing pundits over the years. And what's interesting now is that you have a Marxist professor by the name of Gabriel Rockhill, who has published this is going to be remarkably a 3-volume work called "Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism," that promises to show, contrary to what the right-wing account claims, that the real function of these Western Marxists, aka Frankfurt School intellectuals, was to undermine the struggle for communism, and that the real role that they played was to forge a kind of what he calls a compatible Marxism that could exist comfortably under the rubric of Western capitalism, and that would cut off, as he sees it, any ties between the Western left and that of what's now called the global South, as well as actually existing socialism as it was called in the 20th century, i.e. the Soviet Union and its satellites. As far as I understand today, Rockhill is essentially a pro-China in his politics, and so he thinks the left should really align itself with China. And so he's part of a larger, I think you could sort of argue there's a sort of parallel here with Groypers on the right. I'd say that the kind of lower brow realms of the left have this general sense that, the real allies are these sort of, these rising like global South or BRICS nations. And interestingly, I wrote something about this, that there was a schism at Arctos Press, the major right-wing publisher in Europe, because the editor was fired essentially for being too too pro-China, too pro-Iran, too pro sort of global South. And so you do have these factions within the right, that these sort of multipolarist factions. And so there is a kind of way that this faction, which I'd align kind of with the Groypers, Nick Fuentes himself will say positive things about Stalin. And I'd say there's kind of a particular kind of horseshoe convergence where then you have figures like Jackson Hinkle and these other people in the so-called American Communist Party who also define themselves as MAGA communists, who also have this kind of third worldist or kind of global Southist orientation. And so it's interesting to me because I've been noting these schisms within the right recently that also on the left you have, I'd say, a large contingent, which I'd say has a kind of set of parallels to the Groypers because it tends not to be the most kind of prestigious realms of the left. And it tends to be supported by a kind of mob of very angry anonymous posters, most of whom have, I don't know, like Mao avatars or, various other kinds of symbols of kind of third world communism. And, that then they have certain figures like Rockhill who are slightly more sort of intellectually, academically respectable, who will put out these arguments. And so essentially Rockhill's argument is that the real function of Western Marxism was, it was supported by the CIA and other, the Rockefeller Foundation and other powerful kind of pro-capitalist entities to seed this form of kind of capitalism compatible Marxism in the West. And, presumably the effect of this was to kind of forestall the emergence of a left that would be aligned with various kinds of third world national liberation causes and so on. So, Ashley brought this up in relation to the sort of the way that the Palestinian struggle has become so central. We could also point to Matthew's piece about the way that Palestine replaced Black Lives Matter, and so that the left's kind of center of gravity has, at least the kind of popular left center of gravity, has kind of moved towards these alliances with various kinds of third world or global South type causes. And so, I mean, the strange thing about Rockhill and this book to me is that it very much echoes, not see, I'm unclear like whether or to what extent, if at all, he's conscious of this, but it very much echoes this longstanding villainization of the Frankfurt School on the right. But it does so in order to advance this, again, sort of neo-third worldist politics of alignment with, what are seen as these anti-imperialist forces globally. And so it basically attacks anyone on the left who is not, essentially pro sort of China, in favor of like the increasing power of China, let's say. And I think what's interesting about this is over the past week, at least in internet spaces, this has been really heavily discussed and of great interest on the left. And I do think it has a kind of echo of the Groyper wars that have been happening on the right, where you have this very angry, very mobilized kind of set of online militants who don't necessarily have a particularly strong foothold in any institutions, but also, basically have an ability to kind of mobilize large numbers of anonymous accounts online, and also, I would guess, are able to kind of draw on various kinds of bots and sort of accounts controlled by like foreign intelligence operations of some sort. And so I think something similar is happening on the left, and the way that you've seen people galvanize to defend this, because I mean, I'd say this Rockhill book is largely being kind of ridiculed by respectable academic leftists, Marxists, etc. But there is this uprising of very angry, again, mostly kind of anonymous, although not entirely, I mean, but heavily kind of anonymous accounts defending this. And this echoed something that happened a few weeks ago which was that the NYU professor and sort of notable Marxist writer Vivek Chibber wrote a piece kind of questioning or did an interview questioning the idea that capitalism depended on colonialism. And so this might seem kind of an obscure point, but it made the sort of neo-third worldist faction of the online left very, very angry that he would argue that capitalism was not ultimately rooted in colonial plunder. And so I do think that there is this kind of interesting fracture, even though this may seem kind of bizarre and obscure. There is this kind of interesting fracture line, which, probably has some implications for the left's viability going forward.
That's so. I'm gonna have to read this book. It's on my list. But yeah, that was a very unexpected kind of take on it, because from the outside, it appears to be exactly correct. I mean, it's like the Frankfurt School is, from my, and this was always a problem with me in sublation, is that it seems very obviously to me to be a mostly, but not entirely, wrong turn for the left that has colored its trajectory since then. And while I haven't read I would like to read this book. I'm going to have to, but I would kind of point readers toward, somewhat pointlessly now, because it's no longer available online. But if you can dig it up, there's an excellent essay by Neil Davenport called "Dialectic of Anti-Enlightenment," which was published back in 2010. Which I've always really, really liked, because it does an excellent job, in my opinion, of pointing out the errors of the Frankfurt School's famous story about the rise of fascism, among other things, and the degree to which this has colored our understanding of the horrors of the 20th century and therefore the trajectory of the left. So this idea that Nazism is the endpoint of, famously the endpoint of Enlightenment, rationality, instrumental reason. I mean, there's obviously a kernel of truth in that, but there's this this tendency to kind of blame fascism on mass politics and democracy. So it's like, naturally kind of predisposes those who take this. It's just totally taken for granted, I would say, across the political spectrum, that mass politics is dangerous, and that utterly neutralizes any kind of serious movement, because a serious movement is going to be a mass movement. And it's, oh no, all those working class people getting a little uppity, that must mean fascism. And that's kind of like the legacy of the Frankfurt School's blaming of the Holocaust on this kind of this dehistoricized great man kind. And I'm not saying that this is obviously a horrible simplification of the Frankfurt School, but this sort of echoes the reverberation of it, is that we have this kind of idea of Holocaust remembrance as this moralized stop the hate kind of innate human evil that lurks within all of us, that takes only a great man to bring out. And that famous film that everybody in film school likes to reference, Metropolis, where like just a robot begins to dance and all the people go wild, and that's all that it really takes. And instead, it's that Davenport points out, as many people have since, that actually the greatest support for fascism was amongst the middle classes, and not in the American sense, but the European sense, the sort of professional classes, and the vast majority of working class people. In fact, communist movements and socialist movements had grown during that time, or parties had grown during that time. Anyway, but that's just one example of this sort of the way that the Frankfurt School's understanding of history has colored the left's understanding of history. The other thing is like the blaming of culture, which then becomes a way of blaming the working class. So the working class is, duped by culture, and therefore they will never be revolutionary. And so we have this kind of search for the untouched subject somewhere else who isn't duped by, consumerism and so on in the culture industries and this kind of thing. So I don't know, even if the CIA wasn't directly funding it, they ought to have, because it was highly effective.
Although I think Rockhill would agree with the second point that you just brought up. In other words, he does think that the Western masses are duped by consumerism and are inherently, he and his faction basically buy this kind of Nakai settlers theory of, that like the white Western masses are fundamentally evil. And, therefore I don't think he does think you can really have democracy in the West. I guess I think a lot of these people think that you just have to have, some kind of actual great replacement or something where like, like the white Western masses are overwhelmed and maybe genocided by the revolutionary forces of the global South, which, by the way, if people watch John Carpenter's Escape from L.A., this scenario is how things are going to end. That you have these kind of global South revolutionaries who are like, oh, we're going to like do an actual. I mean, their plan is essentially like what's described in
Camp of the Saints.
Right.
Camp
Sorry.
of the Saints.
Anyway, the point is, I don't know what they actually think, but I mean, certainly they agree with this. Like Rockhill and his sort of neo-tanky crowd of pro-China people, like, I mean, they agree with the idea that the Western masses are hopelessly duped by consumerism and are also just inherently racist and therefore can't be given any kind of power. And therefore, the only path for politics is to support these supposedly virtuous people in other parts of the world who are going to really bring the revolution and destroy imperialism and presumably just kind of neutralize or somehow absorb or maybe genocide the evil whites of the West. So it's interesting how like your like your critique of the Frankfurt School sort of half coincides with theirs, but then on the other hand is actually maybe pointing to a place where they agree with like the crudest version of the Frankfurt School idea. And obviously like Marcuse kind of goes in this direction. I mean, the irony is in a way that Marcuse himself kind of goes in the same direction that they end up going in with his sort of endorsement of the New Left.
Yeah, that's why I said it was surprising to hear that summary, because on the surface of it, it seemed exactly right. And it's funny, your characterization is so ironic because about the sort of like great replacement implicit in this, because, for somebody who's like, actually, Western Marxism is exactly what our overlords want. Well, I feel like, importing tons and tons of people from the third world is also exactly what our progressive elites want too. And they, if you go to the magazine today, or yesterday, we have a piece by Lisa McKenzie on Cologne 10 years on. And she, her book, she did this research like, must be 10, 15 years ago. But her book that she mentions in the piece talks about how they were, long before nice middle-class people noticed there was an issue, working class women were having, and working class communities were having to integrate tons and tons and tons of people with vastly different cultural and moral ideas than theirs, and the sexual harassment that came with it, and we know now obviously that it was much worse than just sexual harassment. But her interviewees, the people that she talked to, were like terrified of sounding racist. They're like, it's not that we're racist. Like, I don't want my 15-year-old daughter having crude sexual come-ons when she pops over to the corner store. So this has been going on for a long time, and it kind of ties in with what I was saying before. Like, a part of me thinks that the CIA funded the Mujahideen because they preferred to fight them than the USSR, and our good progressive politicians prefer to fight people from the third world, prefer to fight even the Islamic contingents that they import than their own working class. It strikes me as a powerful parallel, actually, of the CIA funding what would eventually become the Taliban. It's like, oh, what a terrible mistake. Now they have to fight the Taliban. Well, no, they prefer the Taliban over the USSR. And it's the same thing here. They want to destroy their own working class, and they would even prefer to fight internal terrorism in the name of Islamism over working class solidarity and the forces of the working class that had been so powerful in the 19th century. Anything is preferable to that, because that had a real and for them terrifying ability to destabilize the capitalist order in a way that I think implicitly they don't think Islam can. But yeah, so they're putting their eggs in the wrong basket, as I said again before, this sort of like third worldism, because ironically the people in power feel the same way. But I do wonder if, part of this, what directs a lot of people to think like this isn't Western Marxism necessarily, but an implicit and deep running Heideggerianism. Tell me, do you see it, you having read this, do you see this kind of, is it Heidegger, this kind of like anti-modernity that flows through a lot of these movements, that is actually the impulse that is leading them in this direction?
Obviously, this seems like a difficult path to go down, because, but I do think there's, and this is, maybe something we've been talking about doing on blame theory for a long time, but yeah, I think this kind of various forms of anti-modernity are again maybe what would unite the kind of Duginite multipolarists with the sort of third worldists on the left. And, it ultimately is just adds up to a highly regressive politics, which I think you could argue is a kind of validation of the status quo, of a kind of slow shrinking away from the promises of modernity, where that becomes it's a sort of making virtue of necessity type situation.
With that, thanks to Ashley, to Geoff, and to our producer, Stephen Adebato. For more, compactmag.com/subscribe.